Hello, everyone. This is Miss Rojas, and I have inserted captions, and you guys could see that I said before, okay, I'm doing this now. All right, so we are going to start our lesson, and in this specific presentation, you guys are going to be watching this video on your own and then completing the reading and your textbook assignment, which will be listed on your Google Classroom page. So we're going to start off, and we're starting off with chapter 14, section 1, which is Europe in the Middle Ages. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to watch a video, and it gives a little bit of a review of how we arrived at this certain point in history. So we're going to look a little bit into the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire. So we're going to watch a tiny bit of this clip together.
Growing up, we all have impressions of the Middle Ages. We read about knights in shining armor, castles with moats and towers. But when were the Middle Ages? The simple answer, the Middle Ages in Europe are the roughly 1,000 years from the fall of the Roman Empire, and to be particular, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire continues on for most of the Middle Ages, but it starts in roughly 476, and it continues on for 1,000 years as we get into the 14th and 15th centuries. And it's really the time period that connects the world of Rome, Europe during antiquity, and connects it to the Europe that begins to emerge in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. The Europe of the Age of Exploration, the Europe of the Renaissance. Now, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at maps of the various time periods of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are broadly divided into three major sections. The early Middle Ages, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire till about the year 1000. The High Middle Ages, which was a high point for the Middle Ages in Europe, which goes from about the year 1000 to the year 1300. And then the Late Middle Ages, which gets us to the 15th century and is considered not that pleasant of a time to live in Europe. So let's just start with what Europe looked like right after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So as you can see here, this map is referring to the time period between 476, when Odoacer or Odoacer takes over Rome, and 493. And you can see the Eastern Roman Empire is still here, but the Western Roman Empire is now fragmented amongst many Germanic kingdoms. You have the Visigoths, you have the Franks, you have the kingdom of Odoacer or Odoacer. With the fall of Rome, we are entering into the early Middle Ages. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire, which considers itself the Roman Empire, its capital at Constantinople, under Justinian has a little bit of a last hurrah and is able to recapture the Italian peninsula. So it's able to recapture some of the territory that was formerly part of the Western Roman Empire, some of the territory in North Africa that you don't see on this map. But for the most part, Western Europe stays under the control of various Germanic kingdoms. So here we have fast forwarded to the year 814, which would be right around here on our timeline. And you can see a major event.
So we're actually going to pause there because later on we're going to learn a little bit more about Charlemagne's empire and how he was crowned king and that whole process of that. So we're going to continue. So at this time, when we're starting off, is when Rome crumbles, unfortunately. So just like the video had stated, we have to take into consideration that it was the Western Roman Empire, not the Eastern one where Constantinople and Constantine is around in. So at this time is when, the Roman Empire was a pretty powerful civilization until AD 500. That is when all the Germanic tribes started to take control of the land. So they started to invade, and at that point, whatever land they were in, that was the land that they ruled. So I have some examples in the slide of what type of tribes are were the ones that were taking were invading the Roman Empire, and we have the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes, I think is pronounced. And this is just a small map of which were the tribes and which areas they were taking control of and which areas they were ruling. So when the tribes would come into the Roman Empire, many of the Romans would call them as barbarians. So there's a lot of representation of history, and when you guys read different types of history books, it might be they might be labeled as Germanic tribes or as barbarians. And so again, these tribes took control of certain areas and they ruled their areas. And when the Western Roman Empire fell, that's when officially the early Middle Ages started. So now we're going to look at the geography of Europe. And as shown here in the presentation, let me scoot myself over here. We can see that many people, and when we think of Europe and Asia, we think of two different continents, which is true. They are different countries and they're different continents, but we also have to take in consideration that it is actually a landmass. So when we're thinking of a landmass, it's a large, huge, unbroken land area. So as we can see in these maps, Europe and Asia, they are connected. Even though they have a border and they are different continents and different countries, different continents, sorry, they are still connected through a landmass. And many say that Europe is the peninsula of this large landmass that is known as Eurasia. So remember, a peninsula is a land area or a landform in which it is surrounded by 3 different areas of their land borders. So when they meet the ocean or a body of water, it is meeting 3 sides of it. It is not completely surrounded by a body of water, but only 3 sides are. So many consider Europe as a peninsula of Eurasia, as noticed here. And again, Europe is a peninsula of peninsulas. So it's peninsulaception. There's peninsulas in this peninsula that is considered the peninsula of the whole Eurasia. So geographers consider Europe as a Eurasian landmass peninsula, and there are many peninsulas in Europe. We have, as pictured here, we have the Scandinavian peninsula right on top. We have the Jutland, which is right beneath the Scandinavian, right around the North Sea, between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. We also have the Iberian Peninsula, and this is where Portugal and Spain is around, and it's near in between the Mediterranean Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean. We also have the Italian Peninsula, and that's where the country of Italy is located. And we have the Balkan Peninsula, which is right in between the Italian Peninsula and what is known as Middle Eastern Asia. So just like many countries, Europe has a diverse topography. So it has a variety of it, meaning that this topography is an arrangement of physical features. So there's mountainous areas and plains in Europe. And as we can see here in this map, the topography is distinguished by the elevation. So we have that the yellow-orange color is the higher elevation, meaning those are mountains. So we can see that the mountain ranges are near the north of the continent and on the south of the continent. And in between, we have also the mountainous area in the north area is the Scandinavian peninsula. And on the bottom, on the south of the continent of Europe, we have the Alps. And as seen here in The Sound of Music, we can see that the Alps are around there. So if you see in the middle, this is the Northern European plain, and this is a broad plain area. And it goes from France to Germany all the way into Eastern Europe. And this area is very fertile. So there's a lot of growth and people can harvest. And so all the farmlands are able to flourish in this Northern European plain. Sorry for the tippy taps. That is dear old Bella. Sorry, Bella. So now we're going to look at just how Europe has a diverse topography. It also means that their climate is different. And the climate also ranges depending on where you're located because of that difference in topography. So remember, it's the arrangement of land figures and land masses. So there can be areas in which the mountains may block off wind. So it might not be as windy or might not be as cold. So we're gonna look at this video, and someone is animating it, but it really helps explain the different regions. You do not have to memorize what type of climates they are labeled as, but it gives you a pretty good perspective of where the different climates are located in Europe. So as you see here in this video, we're going to start off with the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, and the Balkan Peninsula. And this is considered the Mediterranean climate area. And here we're seeing that the temperature in these Mediterranean climate areas, they're high in the summer and they are mild in the winter. And there's not too much rain in these areas. And again, like we were talking about the fertility of the land, it's very diverse. So there's different types of vegetation that might be in this section, he's gonna be explaining the oceanic climate. And as you can see, this is a bit more diverse. We have the Scandinavian peninsula, so remember there's mountain areas there. We also have the United Kingdom in this section, and it's also a diverse landscape there. And here we're gonna have a little bit of the section of the northern European plains. So we'll just see the diverse climate for these areas. So here, the temperature, the climate is mild in the summer and in the winter. One note that I do want to make is remember the difference between climate and weather. Weather is the data of day-to-day changes. So if you think of weather, you're thinking of that 7-day forecast that news anchors, weathermen usually do, okay? And the climate is the pattern in a long period of time of a specific region. So here we're talking about climate, and we're not talking about this like the daily weather or the change of weather. We're talking about the pattern of a long time period. And here in these sections, we have mild in the summer and low in the winter. That means the temperature is low. And let's see precipitation. Rain. lot of heavy rain. And again, like we explained, the meadows, the plains, that means it's very there's plains, mountains in the mid-century. And now we are going to look at the rest of the Scandinavian peninsula and part of the section of plains and eastern Europe. So here, it's very high temperatures in the summer and low temperatures in the winter. But there's a high precipitation. That means there's a lot of rain during the summer, so that means it's kind of humid and it's always very moist. Now we're looking at other specific regions, the mountainous areas, like they explained, the Scandinavian and the Alps, southern Europe. So very low in the winter and cool in the summer. If we're kind of thinking about like the in our perspective around the house. And then we have polar, which we can probably guess based on word association. It's very rare. Islands, that's more on the bottom part of Spain, around Spain. So we can see that there's different climates, and these climates do vary. Let's see, why is it not full screen? This is great. Let me do full screen. So they vary because of the topography that is present in Europe. So now we're going to look at the waterways. So we have the waterways, which are the different types of rivers that flow in Europe. And the rivers flow in different directions. Not all of them go from north to south or south to north. They go from side to side. It depends on which river you're talking about. So usually these rivers helped form these natural boundaries that we see that many of the tribes would take into consideration to which land they conquered and which land they ruled. These rivers helped out a lot. These rivers also helped creating fertile land. So that means settlers and migrants who chose to stay in a specific area of Europe, they were able to grow plentiful crops, and that means that they were able to establish cities in these areas, just like many ancient civilizations and many other cities and societies and empires. Many of them start around a river. So we think back to China, we think back to India, we think back to Greece. All of these were located near bodies of water, which are a necessity in order to to have fertile land in order to provide food for those who are settling there. And two of the longest rivers in Europe are the Rhine River and the Danube River. So now we were talking about settlers around rivers, so now we're going to talk about the migrants and the invaders. So Europe attracted many different types of groups of people. So in the 1st century in Europe, of course, we have the Romans in Western Europe. So this is the Western Roman Empire that unfortunately fell around AD 500. So they were one of the first ones to settle here, and they created their huge empire, and then came the Germanic tribes around 300 AD, in which they established their rule depending on where they would conquer. Around the same time, we have the Burgundians, sorry for my mispronunciation, and this is around the Alps. So this is in the southern part of Europe that they are located. And finally, we have the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes, the examples of the Germanic tribes that I showed you in a previous slide. and they settled in what now is Scotland, Ireland, and England. And they established themselves and they started to migrate into Europe around this time, which is the Middle Ages, which ranges from 500 AD to 1500 AD. And the Middle Ages began when the Germanic tribes started to migrate. So this was the time after the Roman Empire fell. And once the tribes started to conquer and migrate, that is when the beginning of the Middle Ages was established. And the Middle Ages, they last for about 1,000 years. And again, as I said, remember, it started when the fall after the Roman Empire collapsed, and it ends before the modern age starts, which is around 1500 AD. And every time we talk about the Middle Ages, we're talking about that time era. And when we're discussing about something that is related to the Middle Ages, we call it medieval. So that's why our textbooks are called medieval and the modern ages. So we're looking more into now the history of Middle Ages, which is medieval. So now in this section, you guys are going to read on your own. It is the New Kingdoms in Europe, and it starts on page 387 to 388. So please pause the video at this moment, and after you're done reading, in your notes, please answer these two questions. First one, what was the effect of the fall of Rome on Europe? And then the second one is, how is the success of the Carolingian dynasty related to the collapse of Rome? So at this point, you're going to pause the video. Now that you've completed the reading and you've paused your video, now you can resume. We are going to we're going to watch this 10-minute video, and it really summarizes and gives, I really like this video because it's actually pretty funny, and it gives a perfect detailed explanation of Charlemagne's empire. And so we are going to take a brief look, and we're going to see how the Roman Empire, the church influenced his reign, and how he gained control of the areas and how he expanded his kingdom.
715 and the Frankish kingdom is embroiled in a civil war. It's quite complicated, but to summarize, it was a civil war not between men fighting for the crown, but for men fighting for the title of mayor of the palace, who was in charge of the king's household. In Francia, the king was basically a puppet to whoever held this position, and so people wanted it. There were supposed to be two mayors, one for Austrasia, which was hereditary, and another for Neustria. There was an attempt to merge both mayoralities by giving them both to an 8-year-old, and revolt. A man named Charles Martel seized the opportunity that the chaos brought and managed to defeat his enemies in 718. Charles was given the title Duke of the Franks by King Chilperic II, who again didn't have any real power. Chilperic died in 720 and was replaced by Theodoric IV, who Charles had appointed. Charles saw to increasing the size of the kingdom, and by 730 it had expanded to this, with Charles conquering many of the German-speaking peoples to the east. To the west and the south, though, things weren't so rosy. The Duchy of Aquitaine had previously been part of the Frankish kingdom, but had broken away in the civil war and was now having trouble with their shared southern neighbour. This southern neighbour was the Umayyad Caliphate, which was, at this point, the largest and wealthiest empire ever assembled. The Caliphate, after numerous attempts, had started to conquer Aquitaine, forcing its Duke Otto to ask Charles for assistance. He granted it in return for Aquitaine's submission, and Charles mobilised his army and met the Caliphates here at the famous Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers. It was a decisive Frankish victory and was thus cemented forever as one of the most famous battles in history. The exact importance of the battle is fiercely debated, with opinions ranging from it merely halting further raiding to saving Christianity in Western Europe. Anyway, the Caliphate would try again in the following years, but failed, and by 740 it ceased to be an existential threat to Francia. So in 737, King Theodoric IV had died, and Charles decided he didn't need to appoint another king, and so he didn't. He didn't take the crown for himself, though, and still ruled as mayor until his death in 741. Before his death, the territories of the kingdom had been split between his sons, Carloman and Pippin. In 743, they both chose a new king, Childeric III, but as expected, he had no authority. The first half a decade of their joint rule saw several revolts in the east and some clashes in the south, but it was largely stable. In 747, Carloman renounced his title and became a monk, leaving Pippin as the sole ruler. By 751, Pippin didn't really see the point of Childeric remaining on the throne, and so with the consent of Pope Zachary, got rid of him. He proclaimed himself King Pippin III, the first of the new Carolingian dynasty named after his father. Pippin was an accomplished general and leader, but not as much as his father or his son, and so he isn't very well remembered. He did, importantly, begin the close relationship between the Frankish kings and the popes. Pippin lacked legitimacy, which he could gain from the Pope, who in return would gain Frankish protection from the Lombards. Pippin aided Rome against the Lombard kingdom several times and carved out these territories for the Pope to govern personally, the Papal States. Pippin reigned until 768 when he died. He divided the kingdom between his two sons, Charlemagne the eldest and Carloman. Charlemagne's name comes from the Latin Carolus Magnus, meaning Charles the Great. So Charlemagne and his brother didn't like each other, but fortunately this wouldn't be a problem for long, since in 771 Carloman found himself slightly dead. As such, Charlemagne gained the rest of the kingdom, beginning his transformative sole rule. Charlemagne's first priority was war and expansion. Over the course of his reign, Charlemagne went to war with pretty much everyone, but the reasons for these wars weren't exclusively territorial, but also religious. To the northeast of the kingdom lived the Saxons, who were pagans and had raided the kingdom for centuries. In 772, Charlemagne launched a raid to destroy the sacred Saxon tree called Irminsul, beginning decades of warfare and forced conversions in the region. 773 saw conflict between the kingdom of the Lombards and the Pope, and Charlemagne, who wanted to maintain this prestigious relationship between the Franks and the papacy, came to the Pope's aid. It was a quick war, and the Lombards were defeated the next year when Charlemagne captured its capital, Pavia. He thereafter proclaimed himself as the king of the Lombards, but did keep the territory separate from Francia proper. He also conquered the Duchy of Spoleto and gave some authority over it to the Pope. The war with the Saxons continued at a grindingly slow pace until they rallied behind a man called Widukind. Charlemagne was unhappy with this, and so in 782 he ordered the execution of over 4,000 Saxon prisoners, and in 785 Widukind accepted baptism. The decades following this saw major expansion of the kingdom, starting in 787 with the subjugation of Benevento here. The next year the kingdom expanded further east with the integration of Bavaria and the conquest of Carinthia, which brought the Franks into contact with the very wealthy Avars. It wasn't long before war broke out between the two, and the Franks, led by Charlemagne's son Pippin, invaded. The Avars had lost by 796, and their royal residence, called the Ring, was sacked. Immediately after this, Charlemagne subjugated Croatia and these areas. The next year, Charlemagne finished subjugating the Saxons, so he could finally tick that off. In 799, he did the same to the Bretons, thus making the map nicer to look at, and he also conquered Barcelona. Thus, on the cusp of the year 800, the kingdom looked like this, and it's no wonder that it's sometimes referred to as the Carolingian Empire. Running this massive kingdom required ever more complex and capable methods of administration. The running of the kingdom revolved around the royal court, which regularly moved around the empire to various royal palaces, the most notable being here at Aachen. Aachen was not, as is often believed, the capital of the kingdom, but was an extremely important city in terms of administration and religious reform, as well as being Charlemagne's favoured residence. The kingdom was divided into counties and missatica, which were administrative districts. They were often inspected by Charlemagne's emissaries, called the Missi Dominici, which is Latin for envoys of the Lord. The Lord in this case being Charlemagne and not, God. The missi were made up of two officials, one ecclesiastical, often a bishop, and one secular, often a count, who would make sure the king's authority remained intact and would report back on any potential issues. The church was extremely important to maintaining order and running the kingdom. Bishops and learned men of the church had very prestigious positions at court, and Charlemagne, who was a very pious man, took great interest in church reform. In order to push through reform, Charlemagne would issue capitularies, which were edicts enforcing changes to church practices. The most famous of these capitularies was the Admonitio Generalis, which basically dictated the rules for the everyday lives of Charlemagne's subjects and standardized church practices. It decreed that the Christian nature of the kingdom was immutable and that there was to be a kingdom-wide revival of learning, which we will get to in a minute. The year 800 saw the most famous event of Charlemagne's reign when he went to Rome after Pope Leo III had fled to him because some of his enemies had tried to blind him. Charlemagne went back to Rome with him to sort things out, which he did, and whilst he was there, Leo III crowned him Imperator Romanum, or the Roman Emperor. Charlemagne thus became the first emperor in the West since the fall of Rome over 3 centuries prior. This title didn't really do much except grant a bunch of prestige and wind up those in the still very much alive Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, was at this point being run by a woman, Irene, who had fallen out with the papacy, and so instead of patching things up, they simply picked a new emperor. The big debate surrounding Charlemagne's coronation hinges on whether or not he was the first Holy Roman Emperor, or if it was Otto I in 962. Those living at the time saw no difference between the title bestowed on Charlemagne or Otto I, and the distinction exists in the mind of historians only, who like to categorize things. In fact, the title was seen as no different to the one bestowed on Augustus. So, as previously stated, Charlemagne wanted to ensure that learning was revived in his kingdom, and so he oversaw a period known as the Carolingian Renaissance. The reason for this, much like Charlemagne's conquests, were religious, since it was believed that you couldn't be a good Christian until you knew what a good Christian was. It was seen as the duty of rulers to oversee the salvation of their subjects' souls, and so the exercise of power had to be combined with greater knowledge, a concept known as correctio. From across Europe, he sponsored scholars to come to his court, such as Alcuin from Northumbria, Paul the Deacon from the old Lombard kingdom, and Einhard, a Frank. Einhard, who was close to Charlemagne, wrote the life of Charles the Great, which is one of the major sources about his reign. Schools were founded across the kingdom, the most notable being Metz, Soissons, and St. Gall, and greater emphasis was given to learning. The curriculum was standardized, literacy rates amongst the nobility improved, and a new means of writing was created, Carolingian minuscule. This would see the implementation of many grammatical conventions, such as introducing lowercase letters, question marks, and standardizing letter forms. All of this led to a massive increase in the number of texts produced and a strengthening of the church, whose literacy rate made it indispensable to leaders. Charlemagne undertook much of this learning himself, and there is a common belief that he was illiterate. He probably wasn't, but there isn't overwhelming evidence either way. He didn't learn Latin, which was an official administrative language, until his later life, though, and Einhard claimed that he could speak and read Greek, but the truth of that is less clear. So, now that Charlemagne was an emperor who'd reformed his empire and conquered most of his neighbours, there was only one thing left to do: conquer more neighbours. In 805, after some raiding, Charlemagne took his forces to the east and subjugated all of these people, notably the Bohemians. In the south, there was some more conflicts with the Muslims, and by 812, the Franks had expanded to here. The only power in Europe that could challenge Charlemagne now was the Eastern Roman Empire, which held this territory, most notably Venice. In 812, Charlemagne won a diplomatic victory when the Byzantines recognized him as the legitimate emperor in the west, which might have had something to do with the fact that he had an army just outside of Venice. Whilst the size of the Frankish kingdom may have dissuaded aggression by the Byzantines, it didn't deter the Danes. Pretty much immediately after Francia's borders had expanded to reach Denmark's, raiding had begun up and down the coast. These raids were pretty devastating, but ultimately were nothing compared to what Charlemagne's successors would have to endure. Charlemagne's 47-year reign would come to an end when he died in 814. His eldest son, Pippin, had died in 811, and so he had only one legitimate son left, Louis, better known as Louis the Pious. His reign was somewhat less successful than his father's, though, and he ended up dividing the kingdom up between his sons, which led to the rise of two major states: in the west, the Kingdom of France, and in the east, the Holy Roman Empire. So Charlemagne is remembered as many things: a conqueror, a patron of scholars, as a reformer, and as a protector of the church. After his grandsons divided the empire between them, Charlemagne was considered the father figure of the new states which came out of it. Much of his reign was driven by his desire to be a great Christian king. He believed it was his duty to subjugate the surrounding areas and force conversions within them in order to save the souls of those who lived there. It is important to remember that much of his great legacy was built upon the work of his forebears, Pippin and Charles Martel, without whom there may not have been a Francia at all. One thing is almost universally agreed upon, though: Charles most certainly deserved to be remembered as the Great. I hope you...
Alrighty, so as we can see, Charlemagne, he conquered a lot of Europe. His actual government and how the structure that he had wasn't as powerful, and it wasn't as concrete as that of the church, the Roman Catholic Church. So what he did was, of the Roman Empire. Okay, so his structure of government was not as strong as the Roman Empire, but he had the help of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope to help rule his land. And with their help and their structure, Charlemagne was able to succeed, right? And what Charlemagne did was that he converted a lot of those that were conquered into Christianity. So it was a win-win situation for both. Charlemagne was getting support from the church and the Pope to actually conquer the lands, and the church and the Pope were getting many more subjects and many more people to convert into Christianity, which helped their empire and their structure to become more powerful, since more people were behind them. Charlemagne was one who would go and conquer himself. He was always on horseback. He would go around the lands. He was into the adventure. So that's why it's really important. And it's a great way to actually see what he's remembered as: a conqueror, a defender, a reformer, and one who saw himself as a Christian ruler. So this is the presentation for this section. I would like you guys now to read the section and answer the questions, okay? And then the notes, we will discuss the notes once we meet live, just as a little review and see what you guys wrote there. So please check your Google Classroom to look for your Google Forms assignment for your textbook work, and please complete your reading because you never know if you might get a quiz. All right, you guys, thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful day and that you enjoyed this presentation. I'll see you guys later. Bye.